Hi there, Shane and Caitlin here, and welcome to Science on the Table.
The podcast that covers all things South African science, where we take the tough stuff and break it down into bite-sized bits so you don't have to.
That's right, from soup to nuts. So let's lay it all out on the table.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated institutions or organizations. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the content shared is for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Some information may become outdated as new research emerges. Always consult primary sources or professionals for advice related to your field of interest. The hosts are not liable for any errors or omissions in the content, and listeners should critically evaluate the information presented.
Welcome back, guys. Today we have a very special guest that's going to be joining us on the pod. I think we can all say that we are men at work because we've got someone coming from the land down under. We have got Morgan here all the way from Melbourne in Australia, who is going to be talking to us a little bit about attention deficits and social media in adolescence. So welcome to the podcast, Morgan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So we normally start these little podcast interviews with a little bit of background on who you are and what you're doing.
So I guess before I introduce myself here, since I'm in Australia, I thought I'd do a traditional acknowledgement of country. So I want to acknowledge that I'm actually recording today on the traditional lands and waters of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And so I'm in Naarm, which is otherwise known as Melbourne in Australia. And I'd also like to acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, and that sovereignty was never ceded here in Australia. So that's traditionally how we like to acknowledge where we're at whenever we're speaking and having a formal meeting here. So I'm a registered psychologist. I've previously worked in New Zealand, but I've been working here in Australia for longer than I'd like to admit. And most of my work is as a clinician rather than in research. So I've got my background. I started studying psychology at the University of Auckland during my undergraduate. So I did a Bachelor of Psychology and Sociology there. I've always had a really strong interest in social justice and also working with kids. When I figured out what was I going to do with my bachelor's degree, I moved down to Christchurch and ended up studying my Master's of Science at the University of Canterbury because they had a specific child and family psychology program. So I did a 2 years Master's of Science there. And then I also managed to get into a limited entry postgraduate diploma, which is where we learn the kind of more clinical skills of how to support children, adolescents, and their families through psychology. After that, I did a little bit of work. My internship year was at our Department of Education. So supporting young people with emotion and behavioral challenges, particularly within schools. And then when I finished up, I decided I wanted a new adventure. So I moved to Australia through what we call the Trans-Tasman Agreement. Basically, my credentials were able to transfer over here. And I've worked in a mix of private practice and also non-for-profit organizations. And I guess in a lot of ways, my clients have chosen me. I would say most of the clients I work with at the moment are what we call neurodivergent. So a lot of them are autistic, a lot of them are ADHDers, and actually quite a lot of them are what we call ADHDers, which is where they have both autism and ADHD. I work with a variety of presentations across the lifespan. So I work with a lot of parents in the kind of toddler preschool space, and I work with a lot of children and adolescents and also some young adults as well. A little bit of my personal background's probably important because I know my accent can confuse people, and it'll also probably change throughout this pod because I'm speaking with you guys. My mum's South African and dad's American, and I moved around quite a lot as a kid amongst the USA and then in the UK, and eventually settled in New Zealand. So yeah, if you see any fluctuating accent bits, that's what that is. It's probably important to kind of talk about my ethos and how I practice, because I know that, for example, if you were talking about ADHD with a pediatrician or a psychiatrist or a researcher, you might have a slightly different take than the one that I'm going to be giving today. Here in Australia, we as psychologists, we practice under a competency model, which basically means we have to show that we have the skills to be competent working with certain populations. As of December this year, one of the compulsory competencies is that we have to be neuroaffirming. So basically what that means is we have to use a strengths-based approach that recognizes that there's natural variation within our neurology. I guess seeing autism, ADHD, anxiety, specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, all of those things as natural variation within us as a species, and rather than pathologizing it, which can be really shaming for people within those communities, we need to look at how can we have environmental adaptations. So I guess within that, I'm a bit of a social constructivist myself. I kind of believe that our backgrounds, our experiences really shape how we engage with the world. And everyone has a different cultural experience and context. And within the disability space, we really use the social model of disability here, which is basically that like disability is not about an individual's impairment per se, or what's quote unquote wrong with them, but looking instead at what are the societal barriers or the attitudes that are preventing them from having full participation. So for example, if we're looking at physical disability, a person that utilizes a wheelchair to move around the space is far more disabled in an environment where there are no elevators, or there's no ramps, or a kitchen bench is at someone else's waist height. Whereas if we're able to make accommodations for them, they're able to participate more fully in the world around them. And I guess when we apply that to neurodivergence and we're looking at autism or ADHD, which is our theme today, it's looking at, well, is it something that's wrong with the person, or is it actually that we need to adjust the environment and our expectations and how we're supporting them to find the right fit?
Thank you so much, Morgan. It's really a very extensive but important backdrop. And I think it just sketches a little bit of a picture on, like you said, how you're going to answer the questions, or why you answer questions in a specific way, and the information you provide. Firstly, thank you for the traditional greeting. I do know that it's common practice in Australia to do that when I've been to conferences there, and that's pretty standard. And I think it's a good way to acknowledge the land that we're on and the original owners of the land, or first inhabitants. And then secondly, on the topic of ADHD. So I'm going to try and start off very very small, and
Sure.
Because we're talking about attention deficit, I think it's important for us to maybe start with what is an attention span, just so that we sort of get an idea of the starting block where we're starting off from.
That's a really good question. When we're looking at attention span, essentially what attention is our ability to tune into important information and ignore information that's not important. So depending on your age, depending on your context, where you are, etc., that's going to change. So for example, you're probably going to require a lot more ability to pay attention when you're at a university lecture, as opposed to a 6-year-old in a school classroom, as opposed to an adult who is in a working environment, or if you're in a social environment. Yeah, it just depends on the social context.
I also just want to mention that what you've alluded to in your introduction is a very good example of science in practice, because under controlled conditions in a laboratory or a research setting, we might have certain findings, but then when you go into practice, you realize that in a realistic world, things are not as simple. I think your profession is also a very good example of science being evolving, constantly evolving, and discovering new things about humans and human nature. So, as you've mentioned, an attention span depends, it's really contextual, but can one maybe define what a standard attention span is? Just given social setting, for example, school, work, or
So,
just every day, every day.
so when we're looking at, I guess, what's the difference between ADHD and what we would call, I guess, diagnosable difficulties with attention, or everyday sort of difficulties with attention that naturally happen to most of us, I guess what we're really looking for is the function. So ADHD, look, it's difficult because a lot of people think that there's a deficit of attention. But what's actually happening is it's attention regulation difficulties. So people with ADHD will pay attention differently to what is expected. So for some of them, they might completely hyperfocus and lose ability to pay attention to anything other than what they are paying attention to, or they're not able to filter out the unimportant information so that they can only focus on what's important. When we're looking at what's a typical attention span, it's the ability to function within the social context in a way that is not making life difficult for you, or as largely happens within, I guess, looking at the DSM, how much your behavior is impacting others. So I think when we look at ADHD as a diagnosable disability, or as a disorder, it's a lot of the times historically it's been how much is this behavior making life harder for everybody around that person. And one of the reasons why we're seeing a shift in diagnosis is it's really focusing on the internal world of the person as well. So for example, when we look at ADHD, we're looking at, it needs to be across settings, and it needs to interfere with your quality of social, academic, and occupational functioning. So for, I guess, to answer that, what is an attention span? If you can function across contexts and you can pay attention to the things that are important, you can ignore the things that are not without a significant amount of like cognitive effort, and without creating a massive sort of shame spiral or feeling of there's something wrong with me, then you probably have a normal attention span. If we're starting to notice that, I guess, we're constantly being told that we're not paying attention enough, or we're moving our bodies too much and not being able to sit still, that's when we might be looking more at that diagnostic pathway.
Thank you. I just wanted to also make a comment on what you've said about, and we've actually mentioned that in our first episode as well, about your phenotype and what we see on the outside as a combination of your genotype and the environment. And you've mentioned that just a while ago about how it could be something that might be genetically, or where someone is maybe genetically more prone or predisposed to have ADHD, or whether it's a combo of that predisposition and the environment, or whether the environment is probably a major contributing factor. And I suppose in your line of work, and correct me if I'm wrong, you might want to try and remove a lot of those environmental stimulants or contributors, to see whether that could be managed without medication or without a lot of clinical intervention.
I guess When we look at ADHD, genes definitely play a role, and there is strong heritability. So, for example, if I'm doing a diagnostic assessment for a young person, I'll often recommend it might be worthwhile thinking about the rest of the family and, hey, are we seeing any patterns here? Or is there anyone in the family that's been diagnosed? Because there is that strong heritability link, but it is that, I guess, epigenetic. I guess it's that epigenetic pathway, right? Like there's no one proven gene that's associated with ADHD. So it is about how are the genes interacting within the environment. So, for example, there are strong correlations between marijuana use, alcohol exposure, maternal stress, and smoking. We do see a higher prevalence of ADHD in children that experience that in utero, but none of that's causal. And as I said, there's no one gene that's been associated with it. So when we look at treatment, the evidence is showing that stimulant medication is one of the most efficacious. And we know that it interacts with neurodivergent brains differently to how it interacts with, I guess, neurotypical or quote unquote normal brains. But we also know that, look, ADHD is essentially an executive functioning disorder. Do you know what executive functioning is?
Please explain it for the listeners.
Sure. So executive functioning is basically our brain's ability to plan, to coordinate our thoughts and our actions together, being able to regulate our emotions and manage our emotions so that they're not, I guess, managing us, being able to control our impulses, being able to start tasks, being able to organize things, time management, our working memory, our ability to basically remember something on the spot and then use it while we're learning or planning. All of those things are executive functioning tasks. And all of those things are what we've noticed brains with ADHD find harder. It can also sometimes impact our physical coordination as well, and awareness of space and objects in space. And this is why, for example, lots of the diagnostic criteria includes, do you forget things all the time and misplace your keys or your wallet or those sorts of things? And also it can come with, I guess, that poor internal awareness of your own body state. So, for example, going back to that hyperfocus I talked about, a lot of ADHDers say that when they're really interested in something, they might forget to drink. They might forget that they are hungry and not notice those hunger cues. They might also go, oh, I kind of need to go to the bathroom, but actually I'm in the middle of doing something really interesting and really urgent. And then 3 hours later, they will realize that they actually haven't gone to the bathroom. So I guess when we talk about intervening when it comes to, I guess, like adapting the environment, medication plus also supporting, how do we modify our day-to-day functioning? How do we help with, I guess, organizing those things? How do we control some of those aspects of the environment for the person and build some of those executive functioning skills through repetition? Like that's one of the ways we look at it. Another really important way that we adapt the environment is we take some of the stigma out of it. So, for example, ADHD brains and people with ADHD are more likely to experience more corrections than neurotypical brains. Sit down. Why are you getting out of your seat? What are you doing? Why aren't you paying attention? Are you listening to me? Those sorts of things are the feedback that most children will receive from the time that they're quite young. Oh, they're just constantly moving. What are they doing? And when you think about it, that can create a lot of shame and a lot of stigmatizing around like kids with ADHD being naughty on purpose, which is a myth. Children do well if they can. People do well if they can. But a lot of the times, that's what we might change about the environment, is actually encouraging some of the people that are supporting them to be more empathetic, understanding that it's not laziness, it's actually the way that their brain is functioning right now. So look, there's the difference in the way that dopamine's absorbed in a brain with ADHD as opposed to a brain without ADHD. So that can impact how motivation is processed. And it basically means that those brains aren't getting the immediate gratification and the feeling of success that comes with achieving a task in the same way that another brain would. For a lot of ADHDers, if they're not interested in the task, or they don't see how they can get and feel the dopamine, it is so much harder for them to get started. It creates an almost kind of internalized paralysis, which on the outside looks to other people like, oh, they're just lazy. They're not even starting doing the task. They know that it's important. And I guess that's the thing. Brains with ADHD are motivated by urgency, which is why a lot of very successful high masking ADHDers will also have anxiety. And it's also motivated by interest. So they're interest-based learners rather than this is important, you need to sit down and pay attention.
I think all of our listeners' little hamster wheels are running really, really fast in their heads at the moment. I think a lot of people will identify with a lot of what you've said now. You know, the destigmatization of attention deficit in all of its different forms is so important. I think a lot more people relate to that than we realize, and a lot more people fall under neurodivergent than we realize, especially in our very connected society. With the internet being what it is, the world has become very small. And with that, we get lots of testimony from people all over the world who have similar experiences. And I think a lot of people relate to those experiences, which leads to another problem, which is self-diagnosis and overdiagnosis. So we are going to specifically now move over into children or into adolescents, which is a very large problem, specifically now in South Africa, where children are being overdiagnosed with ADHD and being put on medications very young. Do you feel that children are being overdiagnosed in your experience? And do you feel like the social norms of ADHD are changing with regards to acceptable attention spans?
It's such a great question, and I would argue it's the $1 million question that isn't black and white. So I guess, look, from my experience, I don't actually think here in Australia anyway that ADHD is being overdiagnosed. Look, I think there's a lot of nuance to this conversation about whether it's being overdiagnosed. I think one of the benefits of social media and the internet means that a lot of people who have spent a long time feeling like they were broken and that there was something wrong with them are now actually having a language of acceptance of, oh, it's not, I guess I often use the analogy with some of my clients of they're finding out that instead of being a broken horse, they're actually just a zebra. And for a lot of people, that can be really accepting to recognize that, oh, it's the my brain and the environment mix. Look, I do think sometimes we're not having the nuance and the understanding of differential diagnosis around ADHD. So, for example, there's a lot of things that look like ADHD but are not. So, for example, there's a lot of crossover around trauma and how trauma rewires the brain and impacts the brain, creating a lot of hypervigilance that can look quite similar to ADHD. Now, again, they're also not mutually exclusive. You can have both. It's the same for anxiety. So I know, especially here in Australia, there's a lot of pushback with people saying, oh, everyone thinks everything's ADHD and it's just anxiety. Because when you think about it, when you have a lot of adrenaline in your system and you're feeling incredibly anxious, you're more likely to be jittery. You're more likely to talk really quickly. You're more likely to have your thoughts really disconnected, which are all things that we see with ADHD. So, for example, for me, when I'm looking at that, I'll ask my young people or their parents, hey, when are we noticing these symptoms? Are we actually noticing that the more relaxed and I guess, happy someone is, they're having more of these symptoms, then it's probably not pure anxiety. And one of the difficulties with that as well is people with ADHD wired brains are more likely to be anxious because they also experience a lot of rejection in our current society. There are some studies showing that they are also more, I guess, susceptible to trauma at times, but there's also ways in which it can protect them as well. I guess something that's important to pay attention to when it does come to ADHD is looking at medication and what the side effects are. Medication, stimulant medication, especially if it's the right one, because they're not all made exactly the same for every brain. Some people have to go with consultation with their psychiatrist or their pediatrician to figure out what's the right stimulant for them. But we do know that it impacts ADHD brains differently. If medication is something that helps, it's a tool that is useful. If medication is a tool that is not working, then we don't use it. It's up to the individual choice as well with that. But most pediatricians, especially here in Australia, will not prescribe stimulant medication in 6 years and younger. And also the fact that kids younger than 6 haven't developed executive functioning skills. So they do bounce all over the place. It's just about the intensity, right? I think it depends on who you ask as to whether this is a problem. And from my perspective as a psychologist, I think a label that is lazy and not properly informed and doing the historical, because ADHD needs to be present earlier than 12 years. It is a developmental disorder. So it's something that is present in you from childhood and continues on throughout adulthood. You just typically develop more skills to be able to support it as you get older. And also as executive functioning develops in the brain with our frontal lobes, that also can become easier.
And I understand what you've said about social media, and that's the positive side of social media, and it's so important for people to realize that I'm not alone in this world. There are many other people, and I think that actually helps people function a little bit better knowing that, and they can self-regulate a little bit better just with that information, even if it's just lying there subconsciously. But just yesterday, I actually read an article stating that South Africans rank amongst the highest in global screen time usage. And I think it was about adults averaging like nearly 10 hours daily on their devices. And obviously, there's a concern about the impact on children observing these habits. So, my next question is, does social media have an impact or an effect on the attention spans of adolescents and children?
Yes. Short answer, yes. But I think what's really important is the research shows that there are multiple different types of effects. So social media and technology is a tool, and it is a tool that can be used well, and it is a tool that can be used to our detriment. And so it's whenever there's been studies that I've seen, and I can link a few in the show notes as well if you'd like. But all of the research I've read to date is showing that there's no one result. So, for example, some of it shows that their brains are able to attend to information more quickly and process things faster. But then we also know that, for example, TikTok, Instagram, Reels, that kind of short consumption media, it's kind of like playing the dopamine slot machines, right? It's wired to give you that pleasure. So, for example, we do see with ADHDers seeking more of that pleasure, seeking more of that dopamine. It's an easy trap for them to fall into. But we also know that social media is a great way of being able to connect with our peers. It helps young people to also learn more about technology. I mean, if you ask anecdotally, most parents will say, oh my gosh, my child knows their way around technology way better than I do. And that's because they're getting that exposure while their brain is neuroplastic and is absorbing so much. I think screen time is often demonized. by a lot of parents. There's a trend here in Australia of parents refusing to let their kids use screens. And then we also see, on the other hand, parents who are exhausted using screens themselves and modeling that to the kids.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter how much we say to kids, they are so much more likely to listen to what we do, not what we say. So
Yeah,
anything that we are
100%.
doing, they're going to copy. So you can't say you're not allowed to screen your XYZ age, but they see you on it all the time. They're going to want it.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess it can also be a great tool for learning. It can be used for regulation, but the thing is, young brains cannot monitor that themselves. They need an adult, they need a grown brain to be able to go, okay, that's enough screen time. And I guess what we've seen with the studies around adolescents is that if we increase their connection, if we increase their mindfulness around it as a tool. So I guess as an example with my young people, I'll say to them, okay, notice when you're reaching for your phone or when you're reaching for your tablet or your screen. Is it when you're feeling really low about yourself? Is it when you're feeling really stuck? Is it when you're feeling really understimulated or overstimulated because you've not got enough or too much from the environment around you? Okay, if we're using it, then do we actually feel better after getting off it? Are we noticing that we can actually stop, or do we feel like it's mindless? Do we feel like it's sucking us in and making us feel like internally paralyzed? If that's the case, this tool is not working for you. We need to find another way of getting that dopamine, or we need to find another way of connecting.
Yeah.
And quite a few of the research articles show that if you pair physical exercise and getting out in nature with a mindful approach to using social media, we get really positive effects.
And that makes perfect sense. And I suppose, the typical saying of adults of do as I say, don't do as I do. I mean, that doesn't fly, but because you obviously need to
Mm,
lead by example. And I suppose we're at that point where we can't say no screen time. It's literally
mm,
got to be managed just so we don't reach that tipping point of where it becomes detrimental because technology is there, it's ever evolving, we're constantly being
mm.
exposed to it. So you can't escape it as much as people want to and tell their
Yeah.
children no screen time, but then the parents don't necessarily lead by example. So it's
Mm,
about, I think we're now at that point. In the technology age where we have to try and manage it properly or better,
mm,
like you've said,
mhm,
be more mindful about it, and think
mm,
about when I reach for my phone, is it because I'm feeling low? Is it because I'm bored?
mm.
And yeah, how do I feel actually
And
also, how do I feel after being on social media or after having screen time?
mhm,
Does that make me feel
mhm.
better or even lower in terms of mood?
And I
So
guess going back to one of your original questions, are we seeing that attention is changing? Yes, because with social media, we don't have the same resilience and boredom tolerance because we can access that dopamine slot machine and kind of get it really readily available.
mhm.
And so when we're looking at, look, especially if we come to young children, I know we want to focus on adolescents, but if we're looking at young children, they need to have more like very minimal access to screens and more access to play. That's where that boredom tolerance builds. And
Okay.
then as they become teenagers, it's about going, okay, what are some other ways that you can work through the boredom, if
Yeah.
that makes.
No, it makes perfect sense. Thanks. But can we then extend that to academic performance of
Mm,
students and say social media? Well, you've said that it's that boredom tolerance. So now we're more likely to reach for our phones, for example, across the age spectrum. But can we also link social media exposure or time spent on social media, screen time to academic performance?
From my understanding of the research, there are links, but again, it's more nuanced than that. Because I guess when we think about it, our academic expectations of children in general across the world is ever increasing. I don't know if you guys have spoken to high school students, but they're doing a lot more intensive stuff than I was at that age. And I think social media, again, it can be used for study groups. It can be used as a way for people to gain access to information. And I guess, as much as we talked about mindfulness, digital literacy is really important in terms of looking after our well-being on social media, but also making sure that it isn't impacting our academic performance. So, for example, being able to know how are we using AI effectively, because I know a lot of people are using AI right now. How are we using it effectively rather than getting it to think for us? How are we making sure that we are being mindful of the skills that are needed before we go to the easy and often incorrect answers?
Thank you. I remember reading an article about, it was a study, and I'll actually try and find it, but it was about an intervention group and a control group where I think they took high school students and
Mm-hmm.
they had normal screen time before bed, and the intervention group were reading paperback books just before they go to bed. I think it was for a time of about an hour or so. And they did find that the students who actually read the paperback books performed better in their tests the next day. And I think it was during exam time, but I'm speaking under correction. But they performed better, but it was due to better sleep, because I think the different exposure before bed allowed them to have better REM sleep, which
Mm-hmm.
helped with processing of thoughts and memory, and they were able
Mm-hmm.
to recall a memory better for whatever they've learned the previous day for their exam. But I mean, that's one study, and I actually don't know about many more. But as you've said, these things are very, very much nuanced.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that what we really want before sleep is low stimulation activities. So, for example, a lot of my clients love reading. It's a special interest for them. They are able to hyper focus. And if they were reading a paperback book before bed, they'd be going to sleep at about 3 a.m. So, for example, for them, it's that study would apply really well for most, but it's not going to apply for them. So we choose a different type of low stimulation activity. We basically want our brain slowing down, our body also feeling like it's slowing down in order to get that good quality of sleep. And what's really interesting is, since we're talking about ADHD, ADHDers do have a higher rate of sleep disorders than the typical population. And a lot of that is because I guess their circadian rhythm's a little bit later, but also their brains actually require more sleep. So it can be really, really challenging for them to actually wind down. So yeah, making sure you're doing low stimulation activities before bed is going to be really important for your ability to press reset for the next day.
Okay, so do children with attention deficits or your neurodivergent group use social media differently to those without attention deficits or your quote unquote neurotypical group?
That is a great question. I don't have any research articles necessarily to fall back on with that. I have clinical anecdotal experience with this rather than research, but I think it's still important to talk about patterns. I have noticed that there is a difference in how they are using it. So, for example, a lot of neurodivergent young people, they might misinterpret some of the social cues because we don't have the context of tone, face, body language, those sorts of things. So that can be really difficult. It's more subtle. I've also noticed that in some ways it's a great way for them to find belonging based on their special interests. It's a lot easier to find connection with people that love this really niche topic that you're really interested in if you have a wider net of people. but that also can mean that neurodivergent young people are more at risk of being taken advantage of because of that. So they might not necessarily be able to tell when someone is making fun of them, or they might not be able to tell if, hey, this person's talking in a way that doesn't make me think they are who they say they are. So, look, I know one of the questions you guys had was, what is some of the parental responsibility around social media? And it's really tricky because like one of the things with adolescents is they're trying to figure out who they are. Like that's kind of the main focus of adolescence, is figuring out, who am I? And with that comes independence from their parents. So they're a lot less likely to talk to parents about what's going on social media. Like, for example, I know that the algorithms can be really challenging within mental health in terms of like eating disorders and some of the health talk or skinny talk sort of stuff that's coming out. And when you have slightly more literal brains, or brains that are more susceptible to that dopamine, they're going to be absorbing more of that content than their peers and kind of getting more likely to get taken away with it. But basically, I think it's really important for parents to express curiosity around what their young people are doing, and being able to check in and tune in emotionally to, hey, like, what are you looking at? What's been going on? Is there anything interesting you want to share? And noticing their kids bid for connection if they do share, and grabbing that, because teenagers don't often like to share and will avoid a lot of questions.
I suppose it's a case of being conversational as opposed to being confrontational with adolescents and children
Yes.
using their screens. So it's ultimately it's up to the parents, and just come looping back to that point of trying to be, at least for other adults, trying to regulate that a little bit better, not shy away from it, but try and manage it, and
Yeah.
be conversational with your kids about it.
A lot of what we notice with adolescents is the harder you try and hold on to them, and the harder you try and control, the more that they are going to, like, most of them anyway, the more they're going to push back, and the more they just won't tell you. So for example, if you demonize social media and forbid them for being able to access it, that might feel really like you're in control as a parent. But what often will end up happening is the young people will just find more subtle ways and of being able to access that, because essentially you'd be cutting them off from their peer connections. You'd be cutting them off from the world and their ability to figure out who they are. So they will find ways somehow, but what they will learn then is you're not somebody that they can trust with that information. And so you actually know less about what they are at risk to. Even if they say something wild and out the gate, and every impulse goes, oh my gosh, I need to shut this down. If you react that way, they're going to go, well, I'm never telling mom and dad that again. If you're able to go, huh, that's interesting, tell me more, you might learn a lot about what they're actually being exposed to.
And it actually
And
astounds me how we haven't learned from anything from Footloose. If you forbid people to do something,
yes.
they're still going to find ways to do it, right? I mean, it's just
Oh,
history repeating itself. But on a practical note, when
sure.
you think about your practice on an everyday, on a
Mm-hmm.
daily basis, what
Mm-hmm.
strategies do you apply to assist clients with managing their attention deficits?
It's a really great question. To be honest, it's none of it's foolproof, right? So much of it needs to come from them wanting to make the changes and being able to adapt to the individual. But a lot of what we talk about is interest-based learning. So, for example, if they have a big English project and they need to write on a book about power struggles or authority, those sorts of things, rather than saying, okay, you have to read this exact same manuscript and write the exact same essay that, everybody else is writing, we go, okay, what's a book that you love that has these themes? How can we show the learning? How can we show the understanding of the general concepts we're trying to assess, but actually keep it in line with something that you're interested in. We definitely practice some mindfulness, which can be really challenging because a lot of my clients, majority of them being neurodiverse, they don't have great body awareness. So it's something called interoception, and that's kind of their ability to pay attention to their feelings in their body, whether it's temperature, whether it's pain, whether it's, I guess, actual feelings like sadness versus frustration versus anger. We find mindfulness strategies that they're interested in. So rather than going, okay, we're going to do some deep breathing exercises, I go, hey, let's just blow some bubbles and let's see how long we can blow the bubbles out for in a steady stream. It's really hard to be upset when you're blowing bubbles, by the way. But it's those sorts of things. It's about adapting it to what are they interested in? How are we tuning into that? Basically, making things fun. What's interesting is that habit formation is different in neurodivergent brains. A lot of the times when a ADHDer is brushing their teeth, it's because they go, oh, I need to brush my teeth. And it's a conscious choice rather than them necessarily being on autopilot. So for example, it's like, how are we pairing that with something that makes it more fun?
Okay, so in many cultures, in most cultures, very specifically in South African cultures, names have a lot of power. One of the things we want to cover today is what is the difference between ADD or attention deficit disorder and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I think we need to clear that one up.
Yep. So basically, ADD is the old term and ADHD is the modern term.
They're interchangeable.
Yeah. So basically, ADD was so attention deficit disorder, I think was the DSM-3. And we are now currently on the DSM-5 revised. So basically, the way that diagnoses work is they just evolve with our understanding. And so to my understanding, it was changed to ADHD because it was focusing on the fact that there can also be hyperactivity as part of what interferes with the attention. And what's interesting about hyperactivity is a lot of people think that it's only moving their bodies around in a hyperactive way, but especially with us understanding a little bit more about female phenotypic ADHD, the hyperactivity is often internalized. So kind of jumping from thought to thought. And I guess one of the questions we kind of talked about earlier in terms of ADHD becoming more common, part of it is that we are actually now starting to understand that it's presenting in girls as well. And it's different in girls or those that are more socially motivated and sitting there going, oh, I have to behave. It's what we call high masking.
And then just to expand on that, are there any other less commonly known attention deficit diagnoses or other names that or classifications of this type of group of neurodivergencies?
Not really. I mean, it's called different things in some different countries. I quite like the French TADA acronym, but no, largely this is kind of the umbrella that like attentional deficits or attention dysregulation will kind of fall under. Look, again, I think I mentioned earlier that there's lots of, I guess, differential diagnoses. So things that can look like this that aren't, like anxiety impacts our attention, depression can impact our attention. We can also see in bipolar, for example, we might have that kind of like a hyperactivity and difficulty sustaining attention, but it's a lot more episodic. Whereas in ADHD, it's kind of constant, if that makes sense. You do need to think about, are there other reasons behind why this is happening? But in terms of ADHD itself, that's kind of the one umbrella.
All right, we have covered quite a lot of content. I think we have been extremely thorough. You have been extremely thorough. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. At the end of each of our episodes, we have a little hashtag fake news section where we debunk some myths in each of the respective fields. So just to round everything off, what is one of the biggest misconceptions about attention deficits?
One of the ones I come across the most and really frustrates me is there's no such thing as ADHD. It's just bad parenting. I completely disagree with that. And all of the evidence shows that ADHD is a real thing. We've been able to look at neural imaging and we can see the difference in terms of what parts of the brain light up when an ADHD brain is activated. And when it's presented with a boring task, it goes quiet. Whereas, yeah, it's different for neurotypical brains. And to be honest, it's not about bad parenting. It's not about needing to have firmer boundaries. We actually know that if you use too controlling a boundaries, it creates shame, it creates anxiety. In some ways, in some extreme cases, it can create emotional abuse. And to be honest, most parents are just trying the best they can.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think shaming parents when they have a child whose brain is not built for the environment that we deem to be normal, like that doesn't help anyone.
I just want to remind all of our listeners that this platform is not for diagnosis. It's not in
Mm-hmm.
place to advise anyone on techniques, on anything along those lines. So please remember, if you do have any concerns about your own children, your family members, yourself, please consult a professional. We are doing this for informational purposes only. It's not a good idea to self-diagnose. Please go and seek professional advice if you are uncertain about any of these topics we've discussed today or questions we've discussed today. And what we'll do is make a platform available, as we always do, on our website for any questions that you might have or concerns. And we will do our utmost to get you in contact with someone who can advise you. Or if you have any questions you would like to ask Morgan, we'll get in contact with her on your behalf to answer any of those questions.
Thank you, Caitlin. I thought we could play a little game towards the end, and Morgan's obviously given us a proper rundown on ADHD and what her general practice entails. But she's also mentioned a couple of very exciting terms, and I thought we could maybe just and also try and challenge our ADHD traits. So maybe we could loop back to some of those terms. And Morgan, if you don't mind, if you could just define or explain those terms to us. Can
I
I?
will do my best.
Okay, great. Let's see. First one, neurodivergence.
Neurodivergence is having a brain that is wired slightly differently to what we assume is the default. So we have neurodiversity within a species. So it's basically all brains are slightly different. Neurodivergent means it is diverging from, I guess, what we would expect as quote unquote normal.
Neuroplastic.
Basically flexibility within your brain. So if you think about your brain as a sponge, when it is neuroplastic, that is when it's able to absorb lots of information, where it's able to grow and change. Fun fact, we used to think that our brains stopped growing, but the more we learn about the brain, the more we realize, nah, it's continuously growing. When you're younger, it grows at a faster rate and has more that it needs to learn.
In utero.
Oh, in the womb, whilst pregnant.
Great. Dopamine.
Dopamine is a hormone that our brain create that is a reward hormone. So it's basically when things feel fun, when things feel good, that is dopamine.
Epigenetics.
Basically, the how our genes and the environment that we are in, how they interact. But one of the ways I explain it is it's almost like your genes give you the switchboard and the environment, whether it's in the womb or sometimes even like beforehand for your parents. And then as we get exposed to life, that environment decides which switches is it gonna flip on and off.
Thanks, Morgan. That was great. It was also a little fun exercise to do towards the end. Thank you, Morgan, for coming onto the podcast today and sharing your wealth of experience. I mean, I can tell, and I know we do joke a little bit about, going off on tangents and that it might be some ADHD traits, but it's also a testament to your experience and your passion for the job, because you can talk for hours and we can listen for hours. And unfortunately, we have to kind of keep these episodes a little bit shorter for our listeners. And yeah, so that it's digestible at least. But you did a stellar job in summarizing everything for us. Yeah, from my side, I just want to thank you and thank you for your time being on the other side of the world, trying to accommodate us. It's really appreciated, and we do hope that we can get you on in the future again.
Thank you so much, Morgan. We really appreciate having you on. I think the majority of our listeners are going to be taking away a wealth of information and hopefully stimulating thought, which is what this is all about. We are eternally grateful for your time that you've given us. And if anyone has any questions for Morgan, please do post it on our website, on our social media. We will make sure we get those answered for you. And we will be coming back to those questions in a later episode that will be answering the questions from all of our previous episodes as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the time. It's been really lovely to talk about one of my favorite subjects. And I guess kind of backing up onto what you said earlier, Caitlin, look, this is an informal chat. It's a bit of information. There's so much more research out there and probably even a deeper dive into the science. And it is very generalist. If anybody is questioning this for themselves or for their children, it's really important to go and seek professional advice that's tailored to you and your needs. It's been such a privilege. Thank you so much for having me on.